So as we've said 50 times already, last year was a pretty good year for gaming. It saw a return to form for cinematic storytelling in games and new exciting adventures in franchises that had been dormant and floundering in obscurity for a long time. But there was one game that was almost universally maligned by fans and critics alike, and that game is Fallout 76. Now, full disclosure, we here at Command Prompt did not buy this game. We already kinda had a feeling of what experience it would offer before the game even launched. No, we did not find the idea of no traditional NPCs very compelling, nor was the prospect of a world 16 times larger than Fallout 4 make us sit back in awe at what Bethesda had done. And so, as we do not own Fallout 76, it would really be unfair to call this a quick critique of that game. Instead, this will be more or less a video essay talking about Bethesda's style of RPG, and what 76's release means for their future titles, by examining their previous releases up until that point, of course. Looking back at the last generation of consoles, few releases stand out like Fallout 3. The title that put Bethesda on a lot of my friends' radars back in 2008, and the reason that Fallout 3 stands out so much is that it was many people's first foray into the distinct and vibrant world of the Fallout universe. The game is still widely regarded as a classic, and I would call it Bethesda's best effort in gaming, even despite the flaws that some levy against it. The story was grand while remaining on a personal and grounded level, the side content was abundant, and the locations and characters just exude charisma and charm. Over 10 years later, and the game is still fun to boot up and play around in. Fast forward to 2010, which saw the release of Fallout New Vegas, and the switch from Bethesda's in-house studio to Obsidian Entertainment, which in turn brought about a few core changes to the formula established by Fallout 3. Gone was the emphasis on the main story quest, and more focus was placed on interactive storytelling. The main story is significantly shorter and more streamlined, but as a result, the varying options and outcomes makes for a much more replayable experience. There are so many different approaches and avenues for players to experiment with, that there is no way to experience even half of what the game has to offer in a single playthrough. To put it plainly, Fallout New Vegas is a role-playing game through and through, and one that still seems to overshadow current offerings with its depth and accessibility. Now, here's the thing. We've already discussed Skyrim in its own video from Season 1, and the feelings expressed in that video are still very, very valid here. But the biggest flaw of Skyrim, and one that has to be restated relevant to Fallout 76 and Bethesda as a studio, is its quest structure. What I mean by that is the quests in Skyrim seem to follow a more linear flow. Fallout 3 is often criticized for quests that lack originality, and that follow a basic structure of going from point A to B, do a thing, and then go back to point A. What Skyrim typically does in its quest structure is the same, but replace do a thing with pick up a thing. See, the one thing that really keeps me from enjoying Skyrim, aside from the invincible plot characters, the broken progression system, the glitches, the bugs, the countless releases, is the ever-present feeling that my character is really only in Skyrim to fulfill a prophecy and bring people stuff. And Bethesda has been more than happy to coast on that through several hardware generations. They seem to think that Skyrim is the gold standard for their game design, even though every time I personally boot up Skyrim, it feels like less than a fantasy RPG and more like a trip to the local Kroger with my mom's shopping list. Right, Brussels sprouts over there, V8 juice, got it, an Elder Scroll.
Fetch something for me.
Okay, so moving past Skyrim, here's where things get interesting. I think we can all agree that Fallout 4 strayed away from RPG elements in favor of a more action-oriented approach to its gameplay and design. One needs to look no further than the refined gunplay, the sprint mechanic, and the skill system being replaced with the new perk point system to see what changes are in effect. All of the core design elements in Fallout 4 are catered to a more homogeneous experience. What I mean is that after enough playtime and without a level cap, every player's character will have all the same abilities with which to play. Dialogue options have been mapped and limited to the 4 face buttons on the controller, which neuters player agency even more so.
I'm here now. So you are. So you are.
Weapon crafting adds a small extra layer of depth, but there are only so many unique experiences one can achieve with these conditions. And so the RPG elements of Fallout 3 and New Vegas were limited and streamlined to the core gameplay loop in newer games. To boil it down to its most condensed form, this game feels like it was designed for combat and had RPG elements stacked on top as the game progressed, whereas previous Fallouts were built to be RPGs and had combat mechanics stacked on top of those as the game progressed. See the difference? So what does any of this have to do with Fallout 76? Well, in a sense, it has everything to do with it. Fallout 3, 4, and Skyrim all have something very interesting in common, something that New Vegas does not share with them, and that is that all 3 of those games introduce you to their setting and world with an extended tutorial section that takes up as much of an hour of the beginning of the game. Fallout 3 always begins you in Vault 101, about as early on in the character story as you can get, teaching you the ins and the outs of your build and the dialogue system, and then points you in the direction of Megaton. Fallout 4 always begins with the end of civilization, and the descent into or ascension from Vault 111, and then sets you back into the new world and Sanctuary, the home you left behind. And Skyrim always starts you off on your own execution and then making the trek to Riverwood. The point I'm trying to make here is that these 3 games, all developed by Bethesda Studios, make the same mistake of attempting to railroad the player in a specific direction during the beginning hours of their journey. And it's in this sense that the game doesn't really start until the training wheels are removed, and that's what ultimately seems to be what people are complaining about when criticizing Bethesda's RPG offerings. Fallout New Vegas does have a character creation and a tutorial section, but the very first quest opportunity for the player is a choice, and as such, presents a fork in the road for your character. And the choices in that game gain momentum and start to cascade as you make certain decisions, instilling a sense of value and agency to the player with every quest, dialogue exchange, random murder, etc. Instead of that first trek to Riverwood or Megaton or Sanctuary always being the same, New Vegas opens up in a unique way that allows players to begin shaping their own story only after a few moments from pressing the start button. But it is this design choice that can also be traced to the root of Fallout 76's problems as a whole. Because Fallout 76 attempts to provide the same kind of freedom while somehow completely misunderstanding what makes that freedom so compelling in the first place. Okay, now on to us talking about the actual game. Fallout 76 So Fallout 76 opens quickly enough with character creation, and the player leaves the vault to a sprawling world full of possibilities. And in these opening moments, you basically get all the information needed to deconstruct and analyze the problems inherent to this game at a fundamental level. First 5 minutes. And ironically, the majority of these problems come from Bethesda ditching their established formula for something less strict and significantly less intrusive to the player in how it presents quests and its structure. One key difference right off the bat is that there is no railroaded questline that the player is, let's say, incentivized to take like in Fallout 3 and 4. The player is more or less free to roam anywhere they please, allowed to go shape their own story only after a few minutes from pressing the start button. Sound familiar? It should. I literally just read it from the previous paragraph up there. This idea that you can go and do whatever you want as soon as you exit the vault sounds like endless possibilities, right? We'll come back to that. Another major change that goes hand in hand with the lack of defined structural start point and the aforementioned lack of traditional NPCs, there are no people in this world outside of players, and anything resembling a person will be a holotape or a talking computer. And no, I'm serious. Anything in this resembling a living thing is actually a computer terminal speaking. Again, these alterations to the established formula sound like they would make for a much more loose and free-form experience, as there's less focus on a narrative or strict questline and more emphasis placed on what the player wants to do. So what makes Fallout 76's idea of freedom for the player such a flop, while Fallout New Vegas' system is still considered a modern classic? To answer that, understand that the main point of contention, as I see it, is that they both lean into the idea of player choice. But how that term is used here betrays a certain understanding, or maybe a lack thereof on Bethesda's part. You see, player choice is actually a meaningless term. It ultimately has nothing to do with telling a story or structuring a narrative, as any element of playing a game can be called player choice if the player is actively choosing to do something. I can choose to do things in any game, and that is technically the player making a choice. That term is very vague when taken how I've just described, so let's try to narrow down the idea into something more focused and concrete. The term people are typically referring to when they toss around the words player choice is actually more along the lines of interactivity. Now those two sound interchangeable, but I guarantee you I can separate the terms pretty effectively based purely on immersion as it is presented in the game itself, and here's how. Player choice is any action that can be taken by the player to cause some immediate change to the game world, whereas interactivity is any action that can be taken by the player to cause long-lasting change to the world. To give you a practical example, how many people have taken the Magnum in Halo Combat Evolved and killed Captain Keyes on the bridge of the Pillar of Autumn? What happened? Invincible Marines pour into the room and kill you without prejudice, right? That would constitute player choice under my definition. That is a choice that the player is allowed to make, but it doesn't alter the game or its story in any other way than cosmetically, and only in the immediate. In Halo Combat Evolved, you, the player, can kill Marines, Keyes, or even Sergeant Johnson if you so choose, but that does not change how the plot plays out. It can't. Combat Evolved is designed to have one narrative and one outcome. Silly choices that you make in the heat of the moment or goofing around with your friends have no consequences to the story presented in Halo. So the player choice is a fun way to change Halo moment to moment, but it offers nothing in the way of long-lasting effects. This is the key behind RPG design, and most RPGs are designed in the opposite way, to simulate consequences for the player's choices. So, jumping back into New Vegas, killing Mr. House, or engaging in combat with any of the various factions throughout the game will have repercussions for you and your playthrough. This would be classified as interactivity, because your actions have lasting effects on how you're going to be playing and experiencing the game moving forward. And it's this principle that Bethesda just does not seem to understand. Invincible characters who are only treated as such because of their value to the plot fundamentally break the immersion of the world, whereas your choices are supposed to matter. That's why so many complaints are levied against Fallout 3 and 4 when you're not allowed to kill certain people, even as a joke in the heat of the moment, because it betrays an intended path that the developers secretly want you to take in order to experience the story that they want you to experience. And RPG players don't tend to like having 80 or 90% of their actions mean something to them, only for the last stretch of the game to turn into this on-rails, always the same every time kind of experience. Lots of people have complained that Fallout 4's ending is basically the same cutscene with only minimal changes, depending on which of the 4 factions you align yourself with by the end, because you have to align yourself with one in order to beat the game. These complaints are being levied against the immersion and interactivity of the game, as players don't feel as invested when the outcome can only be changed by maybe a sentence or two in the final cutscene. And so, to remedy this problem, Bethesda created a world without the burden of characters or structured interaction at all. A world where the player is the only one changing the world around them, devoid of the structuring points of quests or interactivity. Devoid of interactivity with anything except other players. And that is the bedrock upon which all of Fallout 76's problems are ultimately built. I mean, strip away the bugs and the glitches and the terrible optimization and the game is still a hollow, empty, and very mundane experience. There is no consequence or urgency to all these player choices that Bethesda wants you to feel like you're making, because anything the player chooses to do is only impactful to them, and even then only in the immediate. The game isn't going to remember what you did on Friday night with your friends, nor will it remember why you chose to do it all. The game isn't going to give you a different ending depending on what monsters you and your friends chose to fight Saturday night, or how much you laughed and joked with each other while you were doing it. The game isn't interested in interactivity, but it still wants to adhere to some formality and call itself an RPG because it has player choice. But what do you call an RPG where all these choices are meaningless? As time goes on, we might come to call those kinds of RPGs a very simple name. Bethesda games. Phew. So that was a lot of talking about a bunch of stuff. And with Elder Scrolls 6 and Starfield on the horizon, I'm interested to hear what you all think about the future of Bethesda. Do you think they'll course correct and move back to a more familiar, successful formula? Are you even excited about their upcoming titles in development? I know I'm kinda not. LOL. But seriously, let me know what you think about all this down in the comments below. And as always, I appreciate you for watching. So thanks for stopping by and have a great day.